So tonight, we're going to learn about the Sukkah. And like all things in Torah, it's governed by Halachik principles, which do not always equal what the eye is able to see. It's concepts. It's something called conceptual. There's a conceptual reality. If something looks like a sukkah, it doesn't mean it's a kosher sukkah. For example, if somebody has a little structure and he takes branches and he spreads the branches across the top of the sukkah, it's a nice sukkah, but it's attached to the ground. It's not kosher. So afterwards he chops it off. It's not a kosher sukkah. No. Why? Because it says, Ta'aseh v'lo min ha'asui. You have to make the sukkah, not a sukkah that gets made automatically. So it's not so simple.
But people, if religious, are buying ready to go, boom, boom,
boom. Ready to go, boom, 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 is bim bum. That could be just fine. Yeah. As it could be, or it could not be. You know, you mentioned the ready-to-go Sukkot. Many of these ready-to-go Sukkot, to make life easier for people, it's not a mitzvah to torture people, you know. So they have mats, like bamboo mats. One of the rules in the Sukkah is that the covering cannot be mikabel tumah. It can't be something which is susceptible to ritual impurity. And these are very nuanced, very sophisticated laws. And sometimes, it depends if something was made for the purpose of being a wall hanging or a mat that people sit on, which could be the difference of where it's made. In Canada, people would make something like this to hang on the wall. But in Indonesia, they make it to sit on. We don't sit on the floor most of the time.
No, we don't.
Nah. We sit at chairs and couches. But in certain places, that's common. People have a mat, they spread a mat, they sit, they sleep on a mat. And you wouldn't know the difference. It's not as if you can say, oh, so let me look at it. And once I look at it, I'll know. You can't see the difference because there's an intention component. And my intention in sharing this is that you should understand that when we talk about a kosher sukkah, it's not necessarily what a person would consider a structure or not consider it a structure. There's a question of how you quantify things. And there's specific halachot that tell us about how to quantify it. What is a structure, what's not a structure. Typically speaking, a person would say a structure. Structures. It's an enclosure. It's an enclosure. But we learn a special halacha. This is halacha Moshe Misinai, and we spent the last 2 episodes focused on this, that the sukkah does not require full enclosure. In fact, no. In fact, we learned that the sukkah requires 2 walls and a bit. 2 walls and a bit. And we had a huge discussion about this. And we had to go back and find sources. And we find 4 different methodologies of how we could extrapolate the message from the same verses in the Torah. Because there's 4 different approaches in the biblical exegesis of how you would expound the verses of the Torah.
So you want to build a sukkah. Where do you go? What do you do?
What do you do? It's a good idea to speak to somebody who actually knows the halachot of sukkah before you build your sukkah, because your sukkah might not be kosher. And since you want to do the mitzvah, you want to actually fulfill the mitzvah, you want to make sure your sukkah is kosher. So many of these do-it-yourself sukkahs are made almost foolproof. If you follow instructions, you'll be okay. And then, as I talked about last week, sometimes there are extenuating circumstances. We aren't always living in a land of plenty, in circumstances that allow for us to have every luxury and make the most beautiful sukkah. Sometimes you have to get by. I shared a story with Martin last week about my grandfather's sukkah that he built and how his mother came to look at the sukkah under the nose of the communists in the middle of the Holocaust. It wasn't you couldn't exactly put up a big sign that said Happy Sukkot to hide, camouflage the sukkah. There was people who built little Sukkot in the camps. So you have to know what you're doing. My uncle was on the front on Yom Kippur War.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I was in the Yom Kippur War
So where were you for Sukkot?
in Egypt.
You were in Egypt for Sukkot. You had a sukkah?
No.
No.
Who had the time?
Who had
Almost
time?
lost we had time.
What?
We didn't have ammunition. We didn't have nothing.
So there were some soldiers that had some time, maybe, and they put something hastily together. You have to know.
We didn't see it, but
I understand. Said it. I'm just saying you could be extenuating circumstances, and you try to figure out what the bare minimum requires. I'll give you another example. I am from the people who don't eat out of the sukkah, not even a drop of water, a whole sukkot.
You don't eat from
No,
the
I don't eat anything outside the sukkah. That's what Hasidim do. Chabad Hasidim. Why? Because this is a mitzvah to eat in the sukkah. We don't leave the sukkah. So what if I'm going to have a long drive? Can I open the sunroof of a car and put schach on top? You're laughing, but it might actually work.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what about opening a car door and another car door and putting schach on the two car doors? Does that work?
Yeah.
Yeah. So but it doesn't really have. Does it have two walls? Does it have three walls? How does the wall? So this is where we have a lot of what's being talked about. It doesn't mean that you have to make a sukkah like this. It means that the reality of the sukkah necessarily incorporates many different concepts. Conceptual walls, conceptual enclosures, which are not necessarily what we would call technical fulfillment of the word in English. Now, a person would see it and say, this you call an enclosure? This you call a shelter? You got to be kidding. I said, well, this I call a sukkah. So the Gemara is not the Shulchan Aruch. This is not the rules, the halacha. This is, we're trying to now, looking at the earliest documented sources of the discussions, of the different schools of thought, all of which are correct schools of thought, but of course the halacha has to be ruled a particular way, of how we apply a concept or conceptual enclosure on a practical level.
So if it's not kosher, that means that sitting in the Torah, in the sukkah, is nothing.
If it's not a kosher sukkah, then sitting in the sukkah doesn't fulfill a mitzvah.
Mm-hmm.
It could have value insofar that a person sincerely wants to come close to God, and that's a nice thing. But we believe that the sukkah is real. Something happens. When you do a mitzvah, something actually happens. It's a real thing.
Mm-hmm.
I ask you a question. You're a smart man.
Sure.
You say Kaddish for your parents?
No.
Be'emet? You don't say Kaddish for them. Why?
Just I'm not involved yet in the whole thing.
Okay, so you're getting involved. Let me ask you this. Now that you're coming to a Torah class, would you say a Kaddish?
Slowly, yeah.
Yeah. And do you think it makes a difference to the soul if you stand in a shul and say a Kaddish? I think you think so.
Mm-hmm.
I think people think so. So what are we talking about? Somebody's standing here and saying a few words in Aramaic, he doesn't even understand what he's saying, and a soul, where's the soul? How does it know? We believe in these things. So often people tell me I'm not religious. I'm not religious. I said, really? No, regular people, the Jewish people, I'm not religious. Not religious. I asked them questions like, do you say Kaddish? Do you light a yahrzeit candle? Do you have a bar mitzvah for your...
I light...
Oh, you light a candle.
I light candles for both of them.
For both of them. So you know what I would say to you? That sounds very religious to me.
Yeah?
Yeah, that doesn't sound secular. To me, that sounds... So people do. Elamai.
Certain things.
Elamai. You mean you don't do all the things.
No.
You know what? Let me tell you a little secret. Most rabbis don't do all the things either. Don't tell anybody. I make mistakes too.
I'm sure. A human being.
Oh, so then what's the difference between this human being and that human being? We're all trying to do good things, and sometimes we succeed, and sometimes we fail, and sometimes it's by no fault of ours, and sometimes it is our fault, This is all a little preface. It's a preface. First of all, you're new. I don't want you to appreciate. So, a little preface. And if you're getting bored out there, I'll wake you up soon. Then you can.
It's okay.
A little entertainment never killed anybody. All right. Tough. So we are on the bottom of Daf Vav Amud Beis. Vav Amud Beis, the 6th page. On the very bottom, this is like a page turner class. We're going to go straight into page 7, side A. This is a very interesting shift in the dynamic, because now we are going.
Where am I? Sorry for.
Where are you?
Where are you talking about that I have to follow?
So this is 6B, 6B2. See where this gray line is on the side of the page? Yeah.
That's where I have to follow?
No. You need to go to 6B3. See this gray line? That's this Aramaic, and we're going to be right over here.
Okay.
You got it?
Thank you. Yep.
Fantastic. So we learned that there is halacha Moshe Sinai, which means an oral tradition, not written. It's an oral tradition. It was passed down. One generation was taught by the generation before, and please don't try to invoke concepts of broken telephone, because broken telephone is a game, and this was serious business. We risked our life on this, and we took it very seriously, and wars are fought with oral instructions. You don't always get a written instruction. When
So
people.
why is the sukkah so important?
Why is the sukkah so important? This is really beyond the purview of this little class, but I'm just going to say to you.
Next time.
I'm just going to say to you that the sukkah represents the miracle of our nation's continued existence, despite the fact that we are surrounded by all kinds of different forces that threaten to engulf, overwhelm, and inundate us. Because we were in a midbar.
That's what it is.
Yeah, this is big. It's big. Big stuff. You have to think about that when you're in the sukkah. You have to know that Hashem takes care of you. It's big. The tenuous nature of the sukkah, the reality of the sukkah that allows the inclement weather to get through, and that you never quite have certainty. You never have certainty in the sukkah. You could invite somebody for lunch, but you don't know if it's going to rain. You have no certainty. You're always dependent on God. This is a commentary on Jewish existence. What's the guarantee? The guarantee that God said we're going to be. As another very religious Jew named David Ben-Gurion once said, he was asked if he believes in miracles, and he said, no. In Israel, we just rely on them. And I heard a tape of him saying this, so it's not above him, I said, not a story. There's actually, probably few people would refer to him as religious. That's pretty religious to me, but anyway. So the Gemara told us that we have a tradition going back to Moses, that this enclosure needs two walls and a bit. A bit. How much is a bit? In Hebrew, the bit is called a tefach. A tefach is, in English, a hand's breadth. Why? Because wherever in the world you go, people have hands available. And people's hands are more or less the same size. There are big hands, little hands. The average man's hand is, it's a man's hand. There's a big industry called gloves. They have medium, small, and large. And most medium people will fit, or large, whatever. It's a one size fits all. So there's a size fits all. So the fingers, the 4 fingers, right? This is a tefach. That's a tefach. A fist, 4 fingers. That's a tefach.
So you're building just 2 walls.
2 walls.
So the east and the west.
So let's say, well, this is a very good point you're actually making now. Let's not say that the east and the west are empty. Let's say that the wall would be east and north, or east and south. We're going to discuss in the Gemara what happens if you have east and west empty and 2 walls running north and south. That's a secondary question. But now our assumption is that the two walls are actually intersecting. They make a corner, they meet. So we have either, let's go with east and north, or east and south.
Yeah.
Two walls. Now we need a tefach. That's all for the third wall, a tefach.
That's it.
That's it, a hand's breadth. So the Gemara says, okay, so let me ask you, the oto tefach, and that tefach. So the Gemara says, Heichon ma'amido, where do you put that tefach? Where do you put it? Anywhere? Like where do you put this little few inches, let's say 3-4 inches, where do you put it?
So where?
So that's the question. Omar Rav says, Ma'amido keneged hayotze. You put it corresponding to the yotze. What does the yotze mean?
Yotze going in and out of the sukkah.
Yeah, but that doesn't really make sense because we only got two walls here. What do you mean? The whole thing is one big open. So what's the yotze? Yotze means where the wall emerges. Where the wall emerges. So and the corner is where the wall merges.
Right.
But after the walls merge, let's say this is east, and we have a wall on the north. So we have east and north.
Right.
So the walls merge here. Here's where the walls merge. This is where the walls merge, okay? And where did the walls emerge? They emerge on the edges, at the edges. Yeah, you can see the picture in your Gemara. There's a little picture there, which will help you understand it.
Yeah.
So that's the language the Gemara uses. The Gemara uses keneged hayotze. Now, I want you to know that what I'm telling you is the way Rashi explains it. However, there is a very different opinion, a different school of thought, which is advanced by Ramban, in which he says that keneged hayotze means if you take the wall that emerges, the wall's meeting here, and this wall is going along the eastern elevation, and this is along the northern elevation. So where's the yotze? The yotze would be wherever this wall ends. Whatever this wall ends, wherever that wall is going to two imaginary lines, that's the yotze. So according to Ramban, where would that tefach be? In the far corner.
Yeah.
The far corner. The corner where there is an imaginary perpendicular meeting of imaginary walls.
So really, that's when you build the sukkah, that's the only thing you got to
Well, but just learning the Gemara, it's not exactly like this.
No?
A little more. Not much, a little more.
So it's not 4 walls.
It's not
Always
4 walls.
thought,
No, it's not 4 walls. See how much you learned already?
yeah.
Now you know it's easier to make a sukkah. Now, by the way, just as a parenthetical note, precisely because it doesn't have to be 4 walls, you could make 4 walls, but the wall doesn't have to be a kosher wall. Which means if you take a shower curtain and hang it up, it might not be a kosher wall because it's not really a wall. Right. It's blowing in the wind. It's blowing in the wind. Before John Lennon made a song, Blowing in the Wind, there was a sukkah that wasn't kosher. It wasn't kosher. So why not? Because it's blowing in the wind. So it's blowing in the wind is no good. But if I want privacy, I don't like my neighbors so much, maybe. So I want privacy. I don't want him looking into my sukkah. He has to know what my cholent looks like. If I use yellow mandlin or not. I don't want him. So I put a shower curtain outside. If it rains, it's plastic. Who cares? It's frosted. It's not a wall, but it gives me privacy. So in other words, am I relying on it to make it a kosher sukkah? That's going to be a problem. But if I have a kosher sukkah already, and I'm just looking for privacy, that's a whole different kettle of fish.
So that's kosher.
That would be, if you could use your shower curtain, if you have other kosher walls. But the blowing in the wind wall is not kosher. Right.
Okay.
Is there a limit? Because many of the materials we use are flexible. If they're not wood.
There is actually. Yeah.
Luckily, how much it can move and still be a wall?
Yeah. So the Halachik movement is if it moves back and forth 3 tvachim, then we're in trouble.
Invalid.
Yeah. That could be a problem. So some of the Sukkot that they used to have years ago, today they've more or less fixed this problem because a lot of them are using parachute material, which is taunt. But they used to use like canvas. And many of the Sukkot that they were using, the walls, the fabric walls were too loose. Were too loose. That was a problem.
So you can satisfy a good intention, but not be halachically
Yeah?
correct.
That's correct. But you know what? A good intention is like taking the medicine that the doctor prescribed, but unfortunately you took the wrong medicine. It's a different pill, but it was in the right bottle. I did the right thing. I did exactly what the doctor said. He said, take this pill. I took the pill. I don't know why it didn't work. It didn't work because it didn't have that chemical in it. Now, you're going to say to me, but for some people it worked because it was a placebo effect. Good, say there. It didn't do what the pharmacology is supposed to do. Sometimes the mind can heal a lot of things. But the medicine didn't work.
Right.
That's the same kind of thing. So the Gemara says, Omar Rav, Mamide Keneged HaYetz. So you put it out Keneged HaYetz. That's where it goes. Let's take a look in Rashi. Rashi is the little letters on the inside. Rashi says, Makom Shahamechitza Kala. This is where the barrier ends. That's called the emergent. The emergent piece is where it ends. You know, like, I'll give you an example. People say that there are emerging developments. Or in science, we say sometimes when there's cutting edge research, we say the emergent frontier. That's as far as science has gone. So we call it emergent. So emergent means the end of the line. For now, maybe the line's going to be extended. Right now, I'm at the emerging point. So this is emerging. It's the end of where the wall is. That's how Rashi learns. Be'eze sheyirtza. That could be on either side. Remember, we talked about a wall on the east that has a perpendicular wall on the south or on the north. So which yotze? Is it going to be on the edge of the east, of the northeast? Because that's where you have the walls on the south and the east. To the edge of the northeast is where you have an empty area. Or is it going to be on the southwest? Those are your two emergent points. As Rashi says, Im hashtayim mizrachit tzfonit. If your two walls are east, the east elevation, and the north elevation, yasa tefach besof hatzfonit. You'll make your elevation at the edge of the emergent edge of the north. B'mikzoa letzad marav, as it moves in the direction of west. Or b'mizrachit, you put it on the edge of the eastern wall, letzad darom, in the direction going towards south. So, that's pretty simple. Interesting thing, of course, is how Rashi uses Hebrew, Gemara Hebrew, right, like Mishnah Hebrew, right, Rabbinic Hebrew, without diagrams. He describes it without diagrams. That's a pretty good description. I mean, later they put diagrams into the Gemara, the printed version, but it describes it.
So tell me, the Rambam and Rashi and all of the people that came before Rashi, they thought the same thing?
This is a very good question. It depends about which subject. The Rambam and Rashi are seen as contemporaries. Right? They never met each other. The Rambam was in Spain as a child, and then he grew up in North Africa and ends up in Egypt. Right? Rashi is in France. Rashi is a sage of the Ashkenaz Jews. Rambam is a sage of the Sephardic Jews. But many, many, many of the traditions are homogeneous. And although Rashi and Rambam use different words sometimes, there are many, many things in which you see Rashi and Rambam say almost exactly the same thing, and they never spoke to each other.
Wow.
It's fascinating. And then we see sometimes serious disputes, because there are different schools of thought in Torah. But this is a complicated subject. So, the Gemara now says, Omru lei Rav Kahana v'Rav Asi l'Rav. This teaching was from Rav. Rav was one of the great leaders of the Babylonian Jewish community, which at that time was a far larger, more prominent, and scholarly community than the Jewish people living in the land of Israel, Eretz Yisrael. At this point, the Jerusalem Talmud had already more or less been completed, more or less. And there was not that many people, Jewish people living in Israel. Where did the vast majority of the Jewish people live at the time? No.
No?
No. The vast majority of the Jewish people at the time were living in Babylon. And they end up in Bavel. They end up migrating westward, across the upper part of the Iberian Peninsula, and they move eventually into Spain. And that is the origin of the Sephardic Jews. Right? The Ashkenaz Jews are the Jews who were exiled by the Romans into the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire included the Britannia, Great Britain. It stretched all the way up into northern Germany and further, even into Scandinavia. So that's where the Romans exiled the Jews. But Jews were living in Bavel. There was already a huge Jewish community during the Second Temple era. Talmud Bavli is the Jewish people living in Bavel. That's why the word Rav is an Aramaic word. It's a Babylonian expression. In Israel, it was Rebbe. In Babylon, it was Rav. At this time, the two great contemporaries living in Bavel were Rav and Shmuel. So Rav says this halacha. And Rav says this halacha. So Rav Kahana and Rav Asi, who were junior disciples, but still extremely prominent sages, they say to Rav, they ask Rav a question. This is very exciting because we're going to turn the page now. Omru Rav Kahana Rav Asi Rav. V'yamidenu keneged Rosh Tor. Why wouldn't they put it keneged Rosh Tor? What is Rosh Tor? Rosh Tor means the edge of the furrow. That's what it means. It not only used to be, it still is, that farming is done in an organized fashion. Farming is done in furrows. There are furrows. They make a long ditch, and they plant. So once upon a time, this was done to a plow and an ox. Today, it's a tractor. And the tractor does multiple furrows at the same time. In those days, they usually did one furrow at a time. And the ox was a real ox. He could schlep, and he pulled this thing through the ground, a sharp plow. Somebody had to beat it to man the plow and make sure you get through, navigate the way. It could be rocks, other things that could break the plow. And you made a furrow. And then you have to realign things. You make the next furrow. And after you make the furrows, then somebody else comes and puts seeds inside. And in many instances, you need to have somebody else come with a shovel after and cover the seeds. And that's how things grow. And then you leave it during the rainy season in Israel. And in spring, your new produce emerges. Your ground, the ground blossoms. So, the furrows were oftentimes made in a diagonal fashion, meaning the furrow itself is straight, but the edge of the furrow, the edge of the field, they wouldn't go as long. They would go a very, very long furrow, and the furrow next door would be a little bit shorter. They would leave, sort of the edge of the furrow would look like a diagonal. There's various reasons why they would farm this way, but this was a common way of farming, and that was called Rosh Tor. Rosh Tor would mean the edge of the furrows was in a diagonal fashion. And then when everything grew, if you had in like an aerial picture, you would see a diagonal edge of the field.
Rosh spelled like head, Rosh?
Yeah. Rosh like a head.
Okay, and Torah what?
Torah is a furrow.
Yeah, I'm just trying to picture the word.
It's in the Gemara, it's spelled Taf Vav Resh.
Tav, Vav, Resh.
Ken.
That's the head of the furrow.
That's the head of the furrow.
Okay.
So the head of the furrow really means the edge of the furrow. Let's look how Rashi says it. Rashi says, Yamidenu keneged Rosh Tor. Rosh b'mikzoa tzfonis, the head of the shura, of the row, in the edge which was tzfonit ma'aravit, the northwest edge. The northwest edge. Ba'alachson is on a diagonal. It's diagonal. O mizrachit dromit, kishehamechitzot ma'aravit tzfonit. It depends how you have it lined up, where the furrows come, so to speak. What direction you're going in. The nira nota lebeiz mechitzot umechze ka'arba mechitzot. Now Rashi just added a few words giving us the theory of what they were advancing. They said, now it looks like when you place that tefach, it looks like it is actually completing the enclosure. It looks like it's completing the enclosure. So let's think about this. I have in my original picture an eastern elevation, and I have a northern elevation. Where did I place the tefach? On the emergent edge, either at the edge of the east wall, facing west, or at the edge.
Is that what you're talking about? This one?
Yeah.
That's
Or
the tefach?
that's the tefach. Or I have it on the edge of the emergent edge of the north wall, and it's facing in the direction of south. Let's try to think this through now. If I would take that line and just continue it, run with it, where would it end up? Just go straight. Does it ever meet? You have a corner. So you have this direction and you have this direction. So if you add something to this direction or this direction, if the line goes, even in theory, if you imagine that line to be expanding along, if you imagine an elevation, does it ever complete an enclosure? No, because it's always going to be open. So they said to Rav, why wouldn't you put that little piece on a diagonal? Because if it's on a diagonal, it's on an angle, if you would take it through to the end, where would it meet eventually? It would meet the other corner of the wall. So eventually you'd have a full enclosure. So I understand that we're not talking about an actual barrier, but why wouldn't you conceptualize that, at least in theory, like as some kind of mathematical equation or geometric equation, that at least think about it, that you could visualize how it creates an enclosure. Think of it this way. Suppose I had a wall. Suppose I had 4 walls. In the middle of the wall, there's a break in the wall. There's a break in the wall. Does it mean the walls don't exist? No, I mean, there's a break in the wall. But the break in the wall doesn't mean this isn't a walled-in area. It's a walled-in area with a break. How big does the break have to be for it not to be seen as a break in a wall, but a wall and a break? I don't know. It's a good question. Is it 50%, 60%? Like at what point? And this is very interesting because we have something called parutz and omed. And with regard to the laws of Shabbat, we have different halachot about the eruv. If it's parutz or omed, it's not simple. But like simply stated, let's say for Shabbat purposes, to have a private domain, you have to have a walled-in area. If I have a walled-in area and it has a break in the wall, that does not construed or seen as a non-walled-in area. It's just an opening.
But why if I build one wall, and all of that is open? That's not good enough.
3 walls without any question is sufficient.
Sufficient?
Without any question. We're saying you don't even need 3 walls. You need the beginning of a 3rd wall. The beginning of a 3rd wall already suffices. So they asked Rav, okay, why? This is halakha Moshe Sinai is the simple answer. Because the sukkah enclosure doesn't actually need to be fully enclosed. A partial enclosure is also considered an enclosure. Mm-hmm. Seeking shelter. It affords shelter.
And how did they come to believe that this is the right thing to do? Who told them to
This
do
is
that?
a very good question. How did they come to believe it? The answer is, we the Jewish people believe, that there was a tradition from the time of Moshe Rabbeinu. And generation after generation, people dedicated their lives to receiving the tradition and passing it on to the next generation. When all of the other people were busy lionizing violence and warfare, we, the Jewish people, looked up to and respected intelligence and knowledge and learning. That's what we lionized. Ever hear of the Knights of the Beis Hamikdash? Yeah, I never heard of them. Because there was no knights. For us, a knight with a K is the people of the book. Who are our heroes? We had some warriors also, said that. That's not who we are. That's not who we are. This is who we are. So there are various traditions, Torah traditions, which are all Torah ideas, the question of which is the right halacha. So this is the earliest documentation. Till here it was all oral. Now it's documented. So we're documenting these discussions. They're trying to reconstruct some of these things.
So the rabbi that just died, what's his name? 96 years old in Jerusalem.
Rabbi Shalom Cohen?
No, very famous, became a Maran. What's
Rabbi Kanievsky?
Kanievsky.
Yeah.
He built the sukkah like that, in your opinion?
How did he build a sukkah? I don't know.
You don't know?
I'm going to presume that he probably had a sukkah with 4 walls. But I will tell you this. The Baal Shem Tov made a point of spending time in a sukkah that had every possible leniency because he wanted to make other Jewish people look good. He was worried about making other Jewish people meritorious. So he said, I'll sit in a sukkah that's barely kosher, but kosher, so that all of the Jewish people who have their sukkot, which are imperfect, they should be on my back. They should be included in it. They should be able to, he wanted to enrich them also. Listen, my sukkah has 4 walls, Halachik walls.
Yeah, these are leniencies.
These are leniencies. These are what we call the minimums, not the maximums.
Right.
You can always take it further. To be machmir, to be stringent, is not a chachma, as they say. It's not like a big deal. Anybody can be stringent.
Right.
The achievement is to be able to find leniencies, to be able to make it work, even if you don't have all the pieces in place. And we're talking about it conceptually. So they said to him, look, we understand that there's this conceptual idea that a small piece of wall comprises all. We get that. Okay, we understand that. But why? If it's a question just of placing it. If you put it on a diagonal, if you put it straight, like perpendicular, even conceptually, it never meets. The line never meets anything. So there's never a conclusion. If you angled it, automatically it's going to meet.
Right.
Why couldn't you just angle it? Now, according to Ramban's opinion, just by the way, who said that the yotzeh does not mean a little bit of a wall here. According to Ramban's opinion, what they said, instead of putting it on the 4th corner, the empty corner, which it only meets up with 1 wall, why don't you put it on an angle in that corner? So if you put it on an angle, then it meets up with both walls.
Right.
So this is what they asked him. This is what they asked Rav. Put it on an angle. It looks like at least conceptually you could see how these elevations would meet. Okay, they don't meet, but they could meet. Gemara says a very interesting thing. So what did Rav do? The Gemara says, Shatik Rav. Rav was quiet. He didn't pay attention to them. Mm-hmm. Not everything always deserves an answer. Maybe he didn't want to be disrespectful. Somebody's asking if a sukkah is a public domain. And the answer, principally speaking, is no. A sukkah is not a public domain. No, a sukkah is not a public domain. Sukkah would be a private domain. Right? It's an enclosure. Just like we say private domains could be made of various poles and strings, it's not a wall, but it's halachik. It works. So Rav Rav was quiet. So now it's interesting. There's this concept that shtika kahoda. When you're quiet, it means you accept. But that's not ironclad. Not in every situation does silence mean acquiescence. Sometimes silence actually means dismissal.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't even need to be responded to. In other words, the premise is a wrong premise to begin with. What's their premise? They're thinking that we're trying to create with this extra bit of wall, extra bit of partition, we're trying to create an imaginary enclosure. But Rav says, we're not trying to create an enclosure, full enclosure. We're trying to create a third wall. Therefore, there's nothing to be gained by angling it. It doesn't have to meet the other line. It doesn't have to look like an enclosure. 3 walls is a shelter. The fact that the 4th wall is open is not an issue. It's still a shelter. And actually it is so. Mm-hmm. You fought in Israel's wars. You ever in a bunker? Sure. And the bunker was closed on 4 sides?
No.
If it was closed on 4 sides, you were finished. How many sides was the bunker closed on usually? Point in case. Exactly. And it's called a shelter. Yeah. It's open to one side. Okay, it's a bunker. So open to one side doesn't make it not a shelter. And that's
the importance of bringing people to the sukkah.
What's the importance? The importance of bringing people into the sukkah is that the sukkah is the only mitzvah that many people can be in at once, and therefore it represents the coming together of Am Yisrael. It represents real Jewish unity.
Jewish unity.
Yeah? You see, the sukkah is a place where all kinds of Jewish people come together.
Right.
And they're all in the same mitzvah at the same time. So the sukkah is a unifying thing. Mm-hmm. It's an atmospheric thing that envelops us and brings us together.
Very smart.
And it has to be a shelter, but it doesn't have to be an absolute shelter. Shelter. So Rav doesn't have to respond to them. So they're saying, hey, but you could angle it. And if you angle it, then it's conceptually 4 walls sealed off. Rav doesn't even answer. He says, who told you about 4 walls? Who told you it's supposed to be fully closed? That's not the issue. That's not what we're looking for. We're not looking for an imaginary full enclosure. All we're looking for is a 3rd wall. And Halakha Moshe Messina tells us that a 3rd wall is, as such, is a 3rd wall. Now, there is another opinion. This is the general opinion. The generally accepted opinion is that Rav was silent because he simply did not even bother responding. The Baal HaMoir is of the opinion that Rav actually accepted their words, and his silence was an acquiescence. So they came and said, hey, you couldn't make it a closure? And he said, yeah, that's good point. You know, yeah, good point. So the Ritva says, since shtika could be koda'ah, since shtika, silence could be construed or maybe misconstrued as acquiescence, why wouldn't he respond to them? So the Ritva suggests because he didn't want to shame or embarrass them. He didn't want to say, guys, like, what are you talking about? This is not even the subject. This is nothing, this is not part of this whole thing. So he didn't respond. He didn't want to say anything. He didn't want to make an issue out of it. Okay. So the Gemara says now, Itmar Nami. We learned also, Omar Shmuel. Shmuel said, if you remember, I told you that in Bavel, the 2 great sages, the 2 great Torah leaders were Rav and Shmuel. So very interesting. Rav said this, and very interestingly, Omar Shmuel. Shmuel said Mishmei de Levi, a great sage from the previous generation, a prior time, his name was Levi. He says, Ma'amido keneged hayotzei. you establish that tefach at the emergent edge. Keneged Yotzei. The Gemara says, Rabbi Simon, V'itema Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, Omar, he said, Osa lo tefach shochak. Very interesting. He says, you have to make it a loose tefach, not a tight tefach. What does it mean, loose or tight? So this is actually explained there's a Gemara in Masechet Menachot. And the Gemara there says that when you say to somebody a hand's breadth, there's two kinds of hand's breadth. There's clenched fist, that's a hand, and then there's loose. Open hand. That's not open, but like a hand's breadth. And your little emojis, and your iPhone emoji, you have a hand like this and a hand like this. What's the difference with a hand like this? Both are a hand's breadth. There's the clenched hand's breadth and there's the open hand's breadth. What's the difference? How much space is there in between the open hand's breadth and the closed hand's breadth? Actually, not much of a difference. It's a very, very negligible difference. In a whole amma, an amma, which is a significant amount of space, we call an amma is an arm. So let's say 18 inches. That's usually what we go by. A large chair is 24 inches, but if you go 18 inches, the difference between a tefa shochak or not is half a finger.
So it's very little.
It's not very little, it's not tiny, but it's not a lot. And the truth be told, the difference between this, right, and this is not so much. It's a little bit. So the tefach that you use has to be a loose tefach, a little bit of a larger tefach. There's two kinds of tefachim. In this instance, you have to use a larger tefach. And ma'amido, you have to place it bepachot mishalosh tfachim samuch ledofen. When we spoke about placing it at the emergent edge, we didn't mean placing it exactly at the emergent edge. We meant placing it within 3 tfachim. 3 tfachim.
How much is,
Let's, for argument's sake, we're going to go with 4 inches of tefach. So 3 tfachim, 12 inches. It's not exactly like that, but let's make it simple.
This is from the rabbis. This isn't Moshe.
No, well, actually, this is a big discussion. Is Rav Simon arguing with Rav and Shmuel, or is he explaining Rav and Shmuel? There's a discussion about this. There's a machlekes harishonim about it. The Ritva maintains that there's room to say that they are not arguing, but rather elucidating, amplifying, explaining. However, from the way the Gemara puts it, what the Gemara says, I skipped a word, pardon, by the way. I said, V'chein moirim bei medrasha means, and this is the way it was instructed in the house of study, which means more or less, it's like ratified. That's how it is. Not angular, but straight. Mamidi b'resha yetzi. So, Rabbi Simon, it doesn't say, Omar Rabbi Simon v'itei Rabbi Shua, it says Rabbi Simon Omar. And the general syntax in the Talmud is, if it says Omar, then he's adding. But if it says Rabbi Simon Omar, Rabbi Simon says, he's differentiating. He's saying something different. As in, Moshe says this, and Aaron says that. Or, said Moshe, said Aaron. Omar Moshe, Omar Aaron. So Omar in the beginning is different than Rabbi Aaron Omar. Aaron Omar usually sounds like it's a dispute, and that is the general approach. Most of the Mefarshim understand this Gemara that Rabbi Simon is arguing, not explaining, not elucidating. So why is it? Why do we want to do this? Why does he say that when you place that little edge, it has to be 3 tfachim away? Let's take a look at Rashi. Rashi is going to give us some very interesting insight. Rashi says, number one, tefach shochek. Modedin, you measure it, bedalid etzbaot, with 4 fingers, she'einan nogot zu bazu, that are not pressed together, not touching together. Dahava tefach umashahu. So it's actually a clenched tefach and a bit. Tefach and a bit. Uma'amido bepachot migimel. You put it less than 3. Why is this? He says, samuch la'achat hadfanot, to one of those walls, to one of those emergent edges. Upachot migimel kilavud. This goes into something that we spent a lot of time on 2 episodes ago. There's this idea in Torah, which is not necessarily with a sukkah, it's called lavud. Lavud shows up in the laws of Eruv, laws of Shabbat, laws of carrying. Although, in 2 episodes or 3 episodes ago, we differentiated between one kind of lavud and another. One lavud says if something is less than 3 tefachim above the ground, it never left the ground. It's essentially still on the ground. Mm-hmm. That space doesn't exist. It's not in a different domain. Here lavud means that if something's within 3 tefachim, it's like it's touching. That's not really considered to be an interruption. It's basically touching. So what do we gain from this? So if it's lavud, if it's basically touching, v'havele, so then it is seen k'mechitza shel dalet tfachim. It's seen as a wall of 4 tfachim. Okay, we're talking about a sukkah that's 10 amot long. What's the difference if it's a tefach or 4 tfachim? It's still very small. Right. It's 3 inches or it's 9 inches. What's the difference? So he says, I'll tell you what the difference is. V'havele umeshach sukkah, the minimum wall of a sukkah, the size of a sukkah, is shiva, was 7 tfachim. Mm-hmm. Why is it 7 tfachim? Because that's, if you have a squared 7 tfachim, a person can crouch and take shelter. Mm-hmm. So that's the minimum. Nimtzu rubo shel dofen asui. Comes out that most of the wall was done. So 7 is already a wall. Legally, it's already a partition, a barrier. Once we have a tefach, and then we have less than 3 tfachim, automatically we have 4 tfachim. 4 tfachim is most of 7. So why does it have to be shachuk? Why does it have to be open? Well, the simple reason is because it's less than 3 tfachim. It's a little bit less than 3 tfachim, so this makes it a full 4. But if anyway you're talking about having most of, so what if it's a little bit less than 4? So the Ritva says it has to be noticeable. It has to. It's a tefach is not negligible. It's not noticeable. 4 tefachim is already 7 tefachim is a sukkah already. So 4 tefachim is noticeable, and it's noticeably 4. You can see that it's 4. So this is very interesting. Now, by the way, this is the halacha. This is how it has to be. So that 4th wall can be a tefach, but it has to have 3 tefachim and a tefach, which means a sum total of 4 tefachim. And then it becomes a kosher sukkah.
Why is it so important, all of the things that you're talking about?
Why is this so important? Why is it important for us to talk about this? Is that what you meant to ask?
Yeah.
Because we want to fulfill the mitzvah. Mm-hmm. And if we won't...
So if we are not going according...
If we don't go according to these strictures, we didn't fulfill the mitzvah.
Build a sukkah or not, it's not kosher.
That's correct. That's correct. Yeah.
Now what about the above?
The Chag, that's a whole nother story. We talked a lot about that, and we will be coming back to it later on. Okay. There's also many halachot that govern the Chag also.
I'm sure.
So, the term of shochek, if you want to get very technical, comes from the word in Hebrew to laugh.
To laugh?
Yeah. Like schok. It's like laughing or smiling. And why does that mean expansive? An expansive tefach? A laughing tefach? Because when a person smiles, his mouth expands. So it's a smiling hand. Any measure that is slightly larger is always called shachuk because it is open. It's expanded like a smile.
And if they would have said, build it 3 meter by 2 meters, and the tefach will be 20 centimeter by 4 feet. In other words, instead of all of your explanation, how comes they didn't do in numbers, in meters?
Why didn't in numbers? This is a very good question. And the answer is that, for example, in the world today, there's a metric system of meters and centimeters. And then there's the system that's used in the United States of feet and inches.
Right.
Today we live in a small world. And you can buy a device that has metric numbers or, But once upon a time, when people would go somewhere far away, and they don't have a ruler with them, how will they know what's a kosher sukkah? Everybody always has a hand. So all the measurements of Torah didn't use instruments that were made by people, but rather things that were available, natural. So we say, for example, what's a serving? Kizayit, like an olive. Kizayit. What were the olives? Large olives in Israel? They were an ounce. That was the size. So everybody an olive was always available. There's sometimes we say that a certain amount of silver has to be used. We use barley corns. Because barley corns are barley corns are barley corns. Anywhere in the world, a barley corn is always a barley corn.
Right.
Same size. By the way, these vegetables do not reproduce what we call sexually. They don't have male and female barleys that talk to each other. So, but they basically they replicate each other. Mammals that replicate sexually, there's a mixture of DNA. So even if you look like your father or your mother, you never look exactly like your father or your mother.
Right.
And really it says, that at the end of the day, we look like both of our parents, and both of our parents merge together to make one body. And that's you. And you have elements of both parents. But barley corns are just a replication of the generation before. That's why people are always changing, but vegetation isn't necessarily. Right? So this is the way in Torah we learned earlier in this Masechet that the reason we say the land of Israel is flowing with milk and honey, and we talk about dates, we talk about figs, we talk about rimonim. What's so special about these fruits? Are they the most luscious fruits? How can they forget the sabra?
Why?
Why? Because these fruits are actually not necessarily the tastiest, but they're used to measure Torah ideas. So rimon is a certain size that has an influence in many halachot. And the zayit has an influence in many halachot. And the same is true with a date. Chosevet hagasa, the succulent date, right? So this is why we use hands. Everybody's got hands. To measure the hands.
So you built your sukkah like that, exactly?
No.
You need 4 walls.
I have 4 walls, Baruch Hashem.
And then you have a door.
I happen to have a door also. Yeah.
So is that considered kosher?
Sure. Yeah. My sukkah is kosher. But Baruch Hashem, I'm blessed. I have the opportunity to make a sukkah. I have a porch. Baruch Hashem. I have opportunity. There are other people don't have the same opportunities. Right. Some people don't live in a home, or some people live in a condo, and it's not so simple for them. Right?
What do they do? What did people? I guess that time they didn't have condominiums. They didn't have.
People had if you're asking in antiquity, what would happen is that people would live in these enclosures. There would always be a chatzer. There would be like a courtyard in the middle, which is very similar. We have in certain cities. I don't see it here so much in Toronto, but in Brooklyn it's very common, and in Europe it's very common that the apartments, buildings were built like a square with an empty square on the inside.
Indeed, yeah.
So that's your courtyard. And that's where people could put up a sukkah. And that's a shared enclosure.
So then you share it with the rest of the people.
You could. So your question actually now comes up in the Gemara. So the Gemara now says, you wanted to know if the 2 walls were west and east.
Yeah.
And then we said, no. It's north and east, or south and east. Now the Gemara says, what about Omar Rav Yehuda, Sukkah, a sukkah which is asuya kamavui, is made like an alley, which is exactly what your question was. 2 walls. A wall on one side, wall on the other. And it's a thoroughfare. A go-through. Right? Imagine that, a drive-through sukkah. So drive slowly, drink your coffee slowly, you get to the sukkah. That wouldn't work because the car is a separate thing. Anyway, so this is, when you have a mavui, when you have like such an alleyway, this is the question. So Amar Rav Yehuda sukkah, so you can mavui ksheira. The sukkah that's made like a mavui is kosher. That's kosher, it only has 2 walls. He says, okay. V'oto tefach, but that tefach of the 3rd wall, ma'amido l'chol ruach sheyirtze. You can put it on either side. Knock yourself out, put it on either side. Put it on the north side or the south side. Rabbi Simon, v'itema Rabbi Shua ben Levi, we had these people before. They also, here they strike again. Omer, he says, Oselo pas arba, you have to make a piece of barrier or partition which is 4, not 1, 4 tfachim. Umashahu. 4 tfachim and something. Uma'amido, and you have to place it bepachot mishalosha, less than 3, samuch ledofen, near one of the walls.
Wow.
Good question. V'chol pachot mishlosha samuch ledofen, as long as you're less than 3 to one of the walls. Kilavud, it's like attached to me. Guess what? Before we said 1 tefach, and now you're saying 4 tefachim. So what was your question? What was?
The measurement change?
Why? Guess what? The Gemara asks you a question. Is that what the Gemara says? The Gemara says, Umaishna, why is it different? Why indeed is it? Why is it different? Maishna Hasam. So the Gemara answers, I'll tell you. Hasam de Ka'amrit, Sagi Tefach, Shoichek. Over there, you said 1 tefach, so it needs to be a smiling tefach, a wide tefach. Here it's enough to have just a little missing. So he says, okay, but Umaishna, why is it all different? Over here you need 1 tefach, and there you need 4 tefachim. What do we have a shift like this for? So Maishna de Ka'amrit, why is it that you say Ba'aya pas arba, that you need to have a pas which is 4? Over there you said a tefach shoichik, spread fingers. Here you said 4 tefachim and a bit. Why didn't you say 4 tefachim shoichikas? So the Gemara answers. That's very simple. Part of the Gemara says, and here you said 4, and there you said 1. So the Gemara says, I'll tell you why. Hasam, over there where you have 2 walls, 2 barriers which meet in perpendicular fashion. So Hasam over there, that you have shtei defanot ki hilchatan, you actually have the 2 walls that you have are proper 2 walls. It's an enclosure. 2 walls are already an enclosure. So there's already an enclosure to speak of. So therefore, since there's already an enclosure to speak of, so sagile betefach sheichik, it's enough to add just a smiling tefach. That's it. You don't have to add a tefach and mashu. A smiling tefach is good enough. But he says, hacha, the leka shtei defanot, we don't have 2 walls that meet perpendicular. Here we got a drive-through. It doesn't even look like a shelter. You have a wall sheltering you on the north side, on the east side, a wall sheltering on the left side, but this is not a shelter. This is a thoroughfare. 2 walls that meet is a shelter. If a soldier is seeking protection and he wants to be able to, feel that he's secure, if he found a corner like that, perfect. He has a corner and he uses the turret of his gun like this, he's sheltered. So that's a shelter. But if you're between 2 walls, you're not sheltered. You're exposed. So that's not a shelter at all. There's no 2 tefanis. So he says, therefore, ika pas arba, if you have the width of 4 tfachim, and then you add it, of course, to another 3, which gives you 7. So it's an actual wall. It's a wall of a sukkah. It's actually 7. It's a wall of a sukkah. But so then good. Eloi, he says, Loi. Then it's ridiculous, he says. When you have a shelter, you're expanding a shelter. You have emergent edges of the shelter. You add on to the emergent edge, you have already a shelter. But when you have no shelter, just walls, so that already requires you to do something more, to have a third wall. And what is a wall? What is a barrier? The size of a sukkah is 7. That's the size of a sukkah.
Could you go back? Where does it see this, the specifications of a wall?
We learned earlier that the minimum enclosure of a sukkah is 7. 7 tvachim.
Oh, yeah.
So that's the minimum enclosure. So this actually makes sense.
It does.
It actually makes sense. And this is the halacha actually. When you have a mavui like that, it doesn't work. So you know, some of my parents' neighbors in Brooklyn, it's 2 homes with an alley in between. It's an easy sukkah.
They make a sukkah.
Yeah, the 2 homes, you put a couple of 2x4s in brackets from wall to wall, and you build a little bit of a wall on one side.
So you need 4 tefachim, minimum.
You would need at least 4 tfachim, and then 3 tfachim, so it gives you 7.
Right.
Love it. And it works. It's as simple as that. And this could be a phenomenal way to make a sukkah. So, it doesn't have to be hard. And by the way, if you wanted privacy, you can still use your shower curtains.
But this is still a leniency.
It's a leniency.
Interesting.
It's a leniency, but it's actually kosher. It's kosher. When we want to be in a kosher sukkah. Kosher sukkah, that's the important thing. Now, you want to add privacy. The privacy doesn't require a kosher barrier. And as a rule, I want you to know that the sukkah, as long as it's enclosed halachically, is considered to be a kosher sukkah. That even people who are very, very careful with their mezuzot and their tefillin, and they want things which are more stringent, will make a tumul. No, you don't put a mezuzot. No, because it's temporary.
Temporary.
The sukkah is temporary. The nature of the sukkah is temporary. I'm saying even people who are very careful about the sukkah, they're not going to make particular if the walls are, as long as the walls are kosher, the walls are kosher. So this is a very interesting thing. So now we have an application of the conceptual idea that we spoke about with regard to the extra wall, the third wall, which is a wall in concept, a wall in theory. And this shows us how a broken wall is still a wall. But you have to, the broken wall still has to be a wall. So it's broken, but it has to be a wall. And that, my dear friends, is the story of the broken walls, which are really whole. You know, they say there's nothing as whole as a broken heart. There's nothing as complete as the broken walls of the sukkah, and it is complete, and it makes a sukkah, and this is a beautiful thing. And Hashem should help us that by learning about the sukkah, we should merit, Bezrat Hashem, to sit in the sukkah in peace and in happiness and in joy. And hopefully, this year we'll be sitting in the great sukkah of David HaMelech, in the rebuilt Yerushalayim with the coming of Mashiach. B'mheira ubi Ameinu. Amen. Thank you so much for joining. God bless you all. Laila Tov. Keep on coming back.
זהו. עכשיו תגיד לי,